So this will be a review of homework exercise number 5, which is focused on tests of evidence. And the instructions say, evaluate the evidence offered in support of the claims in each of the following arguments. Determine whether the claim is warranted on the basis of the evidence, and if not, briefly explain the flaw in the evidence. Well, not surprisingly, because this is an exercise in tests of evidence, none of the claims really are warranted. So the real challenge here is to explain the particular flaw in the evidence, relying on the various tests of evidence and consideration of the sources of the evidence in making that assessment. So let's take a look at the 10 examples. The first one, American teenagers seem relatively uninterested in television as a mode of entertainment. A 1952 survey published by the Journal of Mass Communication shows that teenagers spend more time at the cinema than they do watching television. Now, there's a couple of good clues here. The 1952 date is perhaps the best. This is obviously a problem with the recency of the evidence. That evidence here is 68 years old. They would need something much more recent to make a claim about American teenagers and their interest in television as a mode of entertainment. And of course, even in 1952, television was a relatively new medium. It was just breaking into the mass market at that period of time. There were still many American homes that did not even have a television. So it would not even have been surprising in 1952 that American teenagers were relatively uninterested in television. That is, that they preferred going to the cinema more than watching television. And in any case, the age of the evidence, that is, it's not recent evidence, makes it inadequate, insufficient to support the claim here. So the problem with the evidence here is one of recency. Number 2, in my personal interview with the reclusive author J.D. Salinger in 2009, he told me that he was in fact the real author of To Kill a Mockingbird, commonly attributed to Harper Lee. American literary history must therefore be rewritten to note this important fact. Well, in this instance, of course, the claim, which we see signaled by the word therefore, the claim would be American literary history must be rewritten to note this important fact. The evidence is a personal interview with the reclusive author J.D. Salinger, who now, of course, is deceased. And because not only was he reclusive, but now deceased, the evidence is completely inaccessible to anyone but the person making this claim. There's no way to check the evidence if there's no documentary written record of J.D. Salinger making this claim, if he didn't write it in a letter or write it in a diary or put it in his will or something like that. There's no way to verify that, in fact, J.D. Salinger ever said such a thing. And so the key flaw in the evidence here is one of accessibility. There's no possibility for any other literary scholar or anyone else for that matter to verify that that evidence is true. Number 3, in Amsterdam, one can go to a so-called coffee house to buy and use marijuana without penalty. It is clear then that federal law in the United States ought to be changed to repeal the prohibition on marijuana as a medical therapy. Well, there's a couple of flaws of the evidence here. The most obvious, I think, is one of relevance. That is, the evidence that's introduced, which is what goes on in Amsterdam with the recreational use of marijuana there, is being applied to a claim about the United States and the use of marijuana as a medical therapy. So we could say that the evidence is perhaps less relevant because it deals with things that go on in the Netherlands, in another country. And also, especially, it's not relevant because it combines or makes an analogy between the use of marijuana recreationally and the use of marijuana as a medical therapy. The evidence, in other words, is beside the point. It's not relevant to the claim that's being advanced here, the policy claim about repealing the prohibition on marijuana as a medical therapy. Number 4, the rhetoric professor said that the chemical reaction between the household cleaning products was what triggered the explosion. The homeowner, therefore, is going to sue the maker of his floor wax and his dish soap. Well, if we look at this, of course, what we're talking about is an unfortunate chemical reaction between two household products. But the claim that's being made is that it was a chemical reaction between the household products as testified to by a rhetoric professor. The rhetoric professor, of course, is not a chemist. He's a rhetoric professor. And so the problem or the flaw in the evidence here is one of credibility. That is, the rhetoric professor does not possess the required expertise to make this claim, that is, to support with testimony or with opinion as to fact the claim that the explosion was caused by the combination of cleaning products. Now, if it was a chemistry professor, that would, of course, would be different. But in this case, we have good reason to question the necessary expertise or credentials of a rhetoric professor in drawing a conclusion about a chemical reaction. So in this case, the major flaw in the evidence is one dealing with the credibility of the source of the evidence. Number 5, the reviews posted by the dating service on its own website indicated consistent success by the service in finding the perfect match. I'm sure if I spend the money to join, they'll match me with my soulmate. So here is a common advertising practice to post reviews, especially positive reviews from your customers. Very often such reviews as posted by a company on its own website, those reviews have been curated, that is, they have been selected because they are the most positive, which brings us to the question of what's the flaw in the evidence here. And in this case, it is obviously one of objectivity. That is, the objectivity of the source of the evidence is in question. The source obviously has a bias, that is, they have an interest in making themselves look good, or they have an interest in having you as a customer draw one conclusion rather than another. And so I think we would be right, thinking critically about this, to question the objectivity of the source of the evidence. Number 6. The first time I took his temperature, he did not have a fever. Then I took it again in half an hour, and it was 103.4 degrees. In another half hour, the temperature had returned to normal. Clearly, he has COVID-19. So in this case, we have medical diagnosis looking at symptoms, drawing from the evidence of those symptoms a particular conclusion, the conclusion being the patient has COVID-19. But the problem with the evidence here, first of all, is obviously one of consistency. That is, the evidence is inconsistent. The patient did not have a fever, then had a fever of 103, and a half hour later had no fever once again. And so that evidence is inconsistent, and being inconsistent, it's probably also then inadequate to draw the conclusion that the patient suffers from COVID-19. In addition, as we know, we would want more evidence that is, other than just the temperature of the patient, to draw a conclusion about whether or not a patient had tested positive for COVID-19. So we would be looking for additional symptoms, maybe cough, sore throat, body aches, fatigue, those kinds of things. And then also, of course, there are some scientific tests now, medical tests that can be taken to show the presence of the virus or the presence of antibodies. And so the evidence of just the temperature is also inadequate. So in this case, there are two flaws in the evidence. One is one of consistency. The evidence is not consistent. And the other is the problem with the adequacy of the evidence. That is, there's not enough or sufficient evidence to establish the claim. Number 7. At least 3 times in the past 12 years, the University of New Hampshire Housing Office has been correct in estimating the number of on-campus rooms needed for the incoming freshman class. So there is no need to worry about whether you'll have a room when you enroll. So here we have a conclusion signaled by so. There's no need to worry about whether you'll have a room when you enroll, but that conclusion is based on evidence that 3 out of 12 years the university has gotten it right in estimating the number of on-campus rooms that will be needed. 3 out of 12 might be good if you're a professional baseball player and it's your batting average, but it's not such reliable evidence when we think about predicting the number of on-campus rooms that will be needed. And in fact, the main problem with the evidence here is one of reliability. We want to test evidence or assess evidence or assess the source of the evidence by looking at the track record of that source. Has the source, that is the person or the institution in this case, proven consistently correct before, or correct at least most of the time? Or has the source been inconsistent or mistaken most of the time? And in this case, 9 out of 12 years, the university has been wrong. And so we would say, in this instance, the source of the evidence is not very reliable. And that's the main flaw in the evidence here. So, number 8. My friend warned me not to take the argumentation class with Professor Farrell. He gave him a D- just because he failed 3 quizzes and skipped 1 assignment. He said Farrell was a terrible teacher. Well, it may actually turn out that Farrell is a terrible teacher, and maybe you'll make a determination along those lines at some point, but I hope not. In any case, looking at this particular example, however, the claim Farrell is a terrible teacher and so you shouldn't take an argumentation class with Farrell is based on evidence, testimony, in fact, by a student who got a D- and got a D- because he failed 3 quizzes and skipped 1 assignment. Pretty good reason to get a D-. In any case, you would look at that testimony and ask whether that testimony might be biased. That is, whether or not the fact that the student had failed 3 quizzes and skipped 1 assignment and so got a D-, that is, maybe didn't get the grade he was looking for, if that in some way biased or colored his assessment of Professor Farrell as a teacher. And if you consider that perhaps there was some bias here, then the obvious flaw in the evidence is one of objectivity. That is, the person giving the testimonial evidence here was not objective in making an assessment of Professor Farrell's teaching. Not objective because he didn't get the grade that he wanted. Number 9. I'm not going to the hockey game with him. He's a Leo, and my horoscope warned me that a Pisces-Leo relationship never ends happily. Well, you perhaps know some people who rely on their daily horoscope to make important life decisions. And if they do, you may want to question their judgment about certain things. There's obviously a number of problems with evidence of this sort. You decide whether or not to be friends or have a relationship with someone based only on your astrology horoscopes. There would obviously be problems with the relevance of the evidence. Is it relevant what a person's astrological sign is in making a determination about whether to go to a hockey game? There would obviously also be a flaw related to the consistency of evidence. So there may be lots of cases, in other words, when Pisces and Leo relationships work fine, or other cases in the past when maybe not knowing what the astrological sign of a person was, you went out and had a good time with that person anyway, right? And so there would be a flaw with the consistency of the evidence, and also with then the reliability of the source of the evidence. That is astrology, that is your horoscope a reliable source of evidence in making such decisions? Or, on the other hand, can you point to cases where the astrological chart was not in your favor, but things worked out great anyway, or cases where the astrological chart was in your favor and things ended up badly, right? And if either of those instances occur, or especially occurred frequently, then there would obviously be a problem with the reliability of such evidence. Finally, number 10, I distinctly heard the voice of God explain to me that I should get an A on my next argumentation quiz. Professor Farrell would commit blasphemy if he gives me anything less than an A. Well, if God actually comes to speak to Professor Farrell and tells me to give you an A, I would indeed give you an A because I would obey God. But the fact that you testify to having heard God explain to you that you should get an A would be inadequate evidence because it's inaccessible to anyone but you. So, again, the main flaw here, like the case of the story of J.D. Salinger writing To Kill a Mockingbird, is that the evidence that's introduced in support of the claim is inaccessible to anybody else. Unless there happen to be witnesses with you and they also all heard God say the same thing, then there would be no way for anyone else, whether Professor Farrell or any other person, to know that in fact the evidence was true, because the evidence is inaccessible. So there's a review of exercise 5. If you have questions on this exercise, please post them on the discussion board.